The auction tent beside a quiet farming community outside Ames, Iowa, was crowded with land investors, agricultural companies, real estate developers, and local reporters. Rising property taxes had forced 80-year-old farmer Walter "Walt" Harper to consider selling the last 80 acres of land his family had cultivated for more than half a century. Wearing faded denim overalls, a plaid work shirt, worn leather boots, and an old straw hat bleached by decades beneath the sun, Walt leaned quietly on an oak walking cane, while holding a weathered metal seed box whose green paint had almost completely disappeared. Around him, investors studied maps, showing the property's location beside a planned highway expansion. They spoke excitedly about warehouses, commercial buildings, and future land values. None of them paid much attention to the old farmer standing silently near the edge of the field. One developer glanced toward Walt and smiled politely. "Sir, you've had a wonderful life here," he said. "But these fields aren't producing enough anymore. The land is worth far more as concrete than corn." Another investor laughed while looking at the cracked wooden barn. "Honestly, we're buying the location, not the farm." A third offered what everyone knew was a bargain price, assuming the elderly farmer had little choice but to accept before tax. Walt listened without arguing. He simply looked across the golden field, swaying gently in the late afternoon wind, before quietly asking one question: "Did any of you come here because of the soil?" The investors exchanged puzzled glances before one shrugged. "Soil?" he replied. "No, dirt is dirt." Walt smiled softly but said nothing more. As the auction manager prepared the paperwork, a black pickup truck suddenly pulled into the field. Out stepped Dr. Freet. Sarah Mitchell, director of the Iowa State Crop Research Center. The moment she saw the elderly farmer, she walked directly toward him and warmly shook his hand with both of hers. "Mr. Harper," she said with unmistakable respect, "I was hoping we would arrive before you signed anything." The investors looked at one another in confusion. Sarah carefully lifted the old metal seed box from Walt's hands as though it contained something priceless. She turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "before anyone buys this farm, there's something you deserve to know." Complete silence settled over the auction grounds. Sarah slowly opened the weathered seed box. Inside were dozens of small cloth seed bags, each labeled in faded handwriting with dates stretching back more than 40 years. Resting beneath them lay a worn leather notebook filled with handwritten breeding records, rainfall observations, harvest data, and thousands of careful notes recorded season after season. Sarah gently held up one small bag of golden rice seed. "Most of you believe this farm is valuable because of where it's located," she said quietly. "The truth is, the most valuable part of this land has never been the land itself." She looked toward the elderly farmer standing beside the field. For 45 years, Walter Harper has quietly developed one of the rarest heritage grain varieties in North America, a strain capable of surviving drought, flood, and extreme temperatures. While preserving nutritional qualities, modern hybrids have gradually lost. Every conversation stopped. The investors slowly looked back toward the old farmer they had dismissed only minutes earlier. None of them realized they had been trying to purchase not just an ordinary farm, but the birthplace of a priceless agricultural legacy that scientists around the world had spent years trying to trace back to its original creator. Before the sun set over those quiet fields, everyone present would discover why the greatest harvest Walter Harper ever produced was never measured in bushels, but in the future of farming itself. The morning sun rose over the rolling fields outside Ames, Iowa, covering 80 acres of ripening grain in a golden light that had greeted Walt Harper almost every day for more than 60 years. At 80 years old, Walt still walked the same narrow dirt paths before sunrise, wearing faded denim overalls, a red plaid work shirt, weathered leather boots, and an old straw hat, whose brim had been repaired more than once by his late wife. In one hand he carried a polished oak walking cane. In the other rested a small weathered metal seed box, whose green paint had long since faded beneath decades of dust, rain, and harvest seasons. Every few steps he stopped to kneel beside the crop, rubbing a handful of grain gently between his fingers before quietly smiling to himself. To anyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than an elderly farmer saying goodbye to the land he could no longer afford to keep. Rising property taxes, nearby highway expansion, and aggressive commercial development had placed enormous pressure on small family farms throughout the county. Rumors spread quickly that Walt had finally agreed to meet with investors interested in purchasing his property. By mid-morning, Pickup trucks, luxury SUVs, survey vehicles, and television crews began arriving at the temporary auction tent erected beside the old red barn. Real estate developers unfolded detailed maps showing future warehouses, shopping centers, and distribution facilities planned for the surrounding area. Agricultural investment firms discussed projected land values while engineers pointed toward the future highway interchange only a few miles away. Very few people looked toward the grain itself. Most saw only empty acreage waiting to become something more profitable. Walt quietly stood near the fence, watching the conversations unfold without interrupting anyone. One developer approached with a friendly smile. "Mr. Harper," he said, extending a business card. "This is a wonderful opportunity. Your family has worked hard here. But farming has changed. This land is worth much more under development than under crops." Another investor looked toward the aging barn before laughing softly. "Honestly, sir, we'd probably bulldoze everything before winter." A third unfolded a purchase contract. "We're offering well above market value." He tapped the paper confidently. "Most people in your position wouldn't hesitate." Walt accepted the contract, read it carefully from beginning to end, then quietly folded it closed. "May I ask each of you one question?" he said politely. The investors nodded. Walt looked across the field, where the grain moved gently with the morning breeze. "How many of you walked into my field before deciding what it was worth?" The group exchanged puzzled glances. One developer shrugged. "We didn't need to." Another smiled politely. "The soil reports are online." A third laughed. "Land is land, Mr. Broken." "Harper." Walt nodded slowly. "I see." He handed the contract back without another word. Several younger investors quietly whispered to one another. "His sentimental. Happens to a lot of older farmers. He'll sign eventually." Nearby reporters prepared cameras, expecting a routine property sale. One local television host quietly remarked that another family farm appeared ready to disappear beneath commercial development. Walt never corrected anyone. Instead, he slowly walked back toward the weathered seed box resting on the porch of the farmhouse. He carefully opened the rusted metal lid. Inside lay dozens of small cloth bags tied with faded string, each marked in careful handwriting with years, rainfall measurements, harvest notes, and short observations recorded across 4 decades. Beneath them rested a thick leather notebook, whose pages had become yellow from thousands of mornings spent in the fields. Walt gently brushed away a little dust before closing the lid once more. At that exact moment, the distant sound of tires crunching across gravel drew everyone's attention. A black pickup truck turned through the farm gate and drove directly toward the auction tent. When it stopped, a woman wearing work boots, blue jeans, and a dark Iowa State Crop Research Center jacket stepped out carrying a locked aluminum case. The moment she saw Walt, she smiled warmly and crossed the field without hesitation. "Mr. Harper," she said, shaking his hand with both of hers. "I'm relieved we made it before anything was signed." The investors looked at one another in confusion. Walt smiled. "Good morning, Dr. Mitchell." She glanced toward the unopened contracts lying on the table before quietly exhaling in relief. Then she turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "before anyone decides what this farm is worth." She carefully rested one hand on the old metal seed box. "I believe you deserve to know what has actually been growing here for the last 45 years. A quiet murmur spread through the auction tent as Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully lifted the weathered metal seed box onto a wooden table. Most of the investors watched with polite curiosity, still believing the elderly scientist had simply come to support an old farmer unwilling to sell his land. Walter Harper stood quietly beside her, saying nothing. He rested both hands on the top of his oak cane, while his eyes remained fixed on the fields beyond the barn. Sarah slowly released the rusted latch and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly folded cloth seed bags arranged with remarkable care. Each carried handwritten labels showing dates, field numbers, rainfall records, harvest yields, soil conditions, and careful observations stretching back more than 4 decades. Beneath them rested a thick leather notebook, whose pages had become soft from thousands of days spent in the field. One developer smiled politely. "Interesting collection," he said. "My grandfather used to keep seeds like that too." Sarah looked at him calmly. "Your grandfather probably saved seeds for next year's crop." She gently picked up one small cloth bag, tied with faded blue string. "Mr. Harper saved these for the next generation." The room grew noticeably quieter. Sarah untied the bag, and poured several handfuls of golden grain into the palm of her hand. At first glance, they looked ordinary, but under the sunlight filtering through the barn doors, each kernel appeared slightly longer, deeper in color, and unusually uniform. One agricultural investor stepped closer. "What variety is that?" Sarah smiled. "That's exactly the question we've been trying to answer for the last 7 years." She turned toward the audience. "Across several independent research farms in the Midwest, we've been studying an unnamed heritage grain with extraordinary resilience. It survives prolonged drought, recovers after flooding, resists several common fungal diseases without heavy chemical treatment, and consistently produces high nutritional quality, even in poor soil." Several reporters immediately began taking notes. Sarah continued. Every genetic analysis pointed toward a single unknown source. She looked toward Walt. "This farm." Complete silence settled across the auction grounds. One developer frowned. "You mean he invented it?" Sarah gently shook her head. "No." She smiled respectfully toward the old farmer. "He spent 45 years patiently creating it." She carefully opened the leather notebook. Every page contained handwritten breeding records, pollination diagrams, weather observations, harvest comparisons, soil sketches, and notes written almost every day since the early 1980s. There were no computers, no laboratory printouts, only thousands of careful observations recorded by hand. One page read, "Cross survived drought. Save seed." Another, "Flavor improved after cool autumn. Continue line." Another simply said, "Grace likes this one. Keep going." Sarah paused for a moment before smiling. Grace was Mr. Harper's wife. Walt quietly lowered his eyes. She tasted every harvest before anyone else. Sarah carefully turned another page. Between two sheets rested a faded photograph of a much younger Walt and Grace, standing beside the first successful experimental field. Written beneath the picture were the words, "One day these seeds will belong to everyone who needs them." Several people in the audience exchanged surprised glances. One reporter finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "If this variety is so valuable, why didn't he patent it?" Sarah looked toward Walt before answering. "Because every time we asked, he gave us the same reply." She smiled gently. "Seeds aren't meant to belong to one person. They're meant to feed people." The investors no longer looked at the fields as empty real estate. For the first time that morning, they saw them as living history. Even Ethan Collins, the largest commercial developer present, slowly removed his sunglasses while staring across the golden crop. "How much could something like this be worth?" he asked quietly. Sarah closed the notebook. "If you're asking about money," she looked back at the old farmer, "you're asking the wrong question." Just then, another vehicle entered the farmyard. This time, it carried the emblem of the United States Department of Agriculture. Two officials stepped out carrying a long protective case used for transporting rare biological materials. The older official looked directly at Walter Harper before walking toward him with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Harper," he said warmly, extending his hand, "we've spent years searching for the original breeder." He smiled. "We never imagined we'd find you still tending the fields yourself." Every conversation stopped as the two officials from the United States Department of Agriculture walked across the farmyard, carrying the long protective case. Their jackets bore the seal of the USDA National Plant Germplasm System, an organization responsible for preserving some of the nation's most valuable agricultural genetics. The senior official, Dr. James Carter, stopped in front of Walter Harper and removed his hat before shaking the elderly farmer's hand with both of his own. "Mr. Harper," he said warmly, "it's an honor to finally meet the man we've been looking for." The investors stared in disbelief. Only an hour earlier they had assumed Walt was an aging farmer struggling to keep an unproductive property. Now one of the country's leading agricultural scientists was greeting him with the respect usually reserved for legendary researchers. Dr. Sarah Mitchell handed the leather notebook to Dr. Carter, who carefully opened it as though handling an irreplaceable historical document. He slowly turned the fragile pages, studying the handwritten breeding records, weather observations, pollination charts, and harvest notes. After several minutes, he looked up and smiled. "This is extraordinary." One investor stepped forward. "Excuse me, but what makes those seeds so special?" Dr. Carter carefully closed the notebook before answering. "Modern agriculture has produced remarkable harvests, but many commercial grain varieties depend heavily on irrigation, fertilizers, and very specific growing conditions, he gently picked up one of Walt's cloth seed bags. "Mr. Harper spent 45 years selecting plants that survived the exact opposite." He looked across the field. Every drought, every flood, every unexpected frost, every extreme summer, year after year. Sarah nodded. "He never selected the biggest plants." She smiled toward Walt. "He selected the strongest families." Carter continued. "Several years ago, we received anonymous seed samples from independent researchers who had been experimenting with an unnamed heritage grain. The results surprised every laboratory involved." He opened the protective case and removed several printed reports. Compared with standard commercial varieties, this grain consistently required less water, remained productive under heat stress, recovered after flood damage, and contained significantly higher levels of essential minerals. Reporters hurried to photograph the documents. One agricultural journalist raised a hand. "Has anyone else successfully reproduced it?" Carter slowly shook his head. "That's been the mystery." He looked toward Walt with admiration. "Every sample we tested carried the same unique genetic fingerprint." He paused. "Until today, we had no idea where the original breeding program had taken place." Silence settled once again over the auction grounds. Ethan Collins looked toward the golden fields with entirely different eyes now. "So this farm isn't valuable because of its location?" Carter smiled. "No." He looked down at the soil beneath his boots. "This land is valuable because it contains 45 years of irreplaceable genetic history." Walt quietly walked toward the edge of the field and knelt, despite his age. He gently scooped a handful of soil into his weathered hands before letting it slowly fall back to the ground. "People think I grew grain here," he said softly. Everyone listened. "The truth is," he smiled toward the swaying crop, "this land raised me." Several people lowered their heads. Sarah carefully opened the notebook again and turned to one of its earliest pages. Written in faded blue ink beside the very first breeding record were only a few words. "Grace says the strongest seeds are the ones that survive together." She looked at Walt. "Was that the beginning?" Walt nodded. "The first year after our wedding, his eyes remained fixed on the fields. We planted 6 small test rows." He smiled faintly. 5 failed. The 6th, he looked toward the grain, now moving gently in the wind, never gave up. At that moment, Dr. Carter carefully reached into the back cover of the leather notebook. Hidden inside was a sealed envelope, yellow with age, and addressed in graceful handwriting. Across the front were only a few words. "For Walter, open this, when the seeds no longer belong only to us." Walt quietly stared at Grace's handwriting for several long seconds. Without saying a word, he gently rested his hand over the unopened letter, knowing that after waiting more than 4 decades, the moment she had written about had finally arrived. The entire auction ground remained silent as Walter Harper slowly lifted the yellowed envelope from the back of the leather notebook. For more than 40 years it had rested untouched between pages filled with rainfall records, breeding notes, harvest yields, and countless observations written by 2 people who believed the future of farming depended more on patience than speed. Walt looked at Grace's familiar handwriting for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. The paper had become fragile with age, but every word remained perfectly clear. He unfolded the letter and quietly began reading. "Dear Walter, if you are opening this letter, then the day we always hoped for has finally arrived. It means someone has discovered that these seeds were never meant to make us wealthy. They were meant to help people we will never meet." The crowd stood completely still. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. Walt continued, "There will always be people who measure land by the buildings they can place on it, by the money it can earn, or by the price someone is willing to pay. Let them. We know that real wealth is measured by the harvests that continue feeding families long after we are gone." Sarah Mitchell quietly wiped away a tear. Walt turned the page. "One day, the weather will become harder to predict. Droughts will last longer. Floods will become stronger. Farmers will need seeds that know how to survive without giving up. If our work can help even one family keep farming through those difficult years, then every failed experiment, every long season, and every disappointing harvest will have been worthwhile." Several of the investors slowly lowered their heads. None of them had expected an elderly farmer's notebook to contain a vision written decades before climate resilience became one of agriculture's greatest challenges. Walt read the final page. "Promise me one thing. Never allow these seeds to become something only the wealthy can afford. A seed fulfills its purpose only when it is planted, shared, and allowed to grow in someone else's field. Walt gently folded the letter and closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he finally looked up, Dr. James Carter stepped forward. "Mr. Harper," he said respectfully, "the United States Department of Agriculture would like to purchase the rights to this grain variety and place it into the National Plant Germplasm System." Walt smiled kindly. "On one condition." Carter nodded immediately. "Name it." Walt looked across the field, where the grain moved quietly beneath the afternoon breeze. "No company will ever own it." He paused. "No farmer who truly needs it will ever be denied it because of money." Carter extended his hand. "You have my word." Sarah Mitchell smiled through tears. "We'll preserve it exactly as you and Grace intended." At that moment, Ethan Collins, the developer who had offered the lowest price that morning, slowly walked toward Walt. He held the unsigned purchase contract in his hands. Without saying a word, he tore it in half, then into smaller pieces, letting them fall gently into a nearby recycling container. "Mr. Harper," he said quietly, "I came here thinking this farm's greatest value was the land beneath my feet." He looked across the golden field. "I was wrong." Walt smiled gently. Ethan lowered his head. "Thank you for reminding me that some things should never be measured in dollars." The applause that followed was unlike anything expected at an ordinary land auction. It was not applause for a business deal or a scientific discovery. It was applause for a lifetime of quiet dedication that had transformed one ordinary farm into a gift for generations of farmers yet to come. As the applause slowly faded, Sarah carefully opened the leather notebook once more. Tucked inside the final page was a simple handwritten sentence that neither Walt nor Grace had ever crossed out during 45 years of work. "The best harvest is the one you will never live long enough to see." No one standing in that field doubted that Walter Harper had just planted exactly that kind of harvest. Several weeks after the auction, the 80-acre Harper farm looked exactly as it always had. The old red barn still stood beneath the wide Iowa sky. The weathered windmill still turned slowly above the fields. Walter Harper continued walking the rows every morning with his polished oak cane and the familiar metal seed box resting beneath one arm. The only difference was that people now traveled from across the country to see the small farm that had quietly changed the future of American agriculture. Farmers, university students, plant breeders, scientists, and agricultural researchers came not to admire the buildings, but to learn from the man who had spent 45 years proving that patience could accomplish what money never could. One crisp autumn morning, representatives from the United States Department of Agriculture, Iowa State Crop Research Center, and several farming cooperatives gathered beside the old barn for a special ceremony. Dr. James Carter stepped onto a small wooden platform carrying an official certificate. "Today," he announced, "the United States Department of Agriculture formally recognizes the Harper heritage grain as a protected national agricultural resource." The audience applauded, but Walter remained quietly standing beside the field, his attention still fixed on the crop moving gently in the wind. Carter continued, "Beginning next planting season, seed banks across the country will preserve this variety. Public universities will continue its research. Most importantly, every licensed farmer who needs it will have access to it without exclusive corporate ownership." Exactly as Walter and Grace Harper requested, the applause grew louder. Sarah Mitchell then unveiled a bronze monument placed beside the entrance to the farm. Beneath the title, "The Harper Agricultural Legacy," were engraved the names Walter Harper and Grace Harper, followed by the words, "They believed the purpose of a seed was never to enrich one farmer, but to help every farmer feed another family." Walter slowly approached the monument before gently placing his weathered hand upon Grace's name. He smiled quietly but said nothing. Later that afternoon, a group of young agricultural students gathered around him while he filled small cloth bags with fresh seed from the latest harvest. One student finally asked the question everyone had wondered since hearing his story. "Mr. Harper, after all these years, what was your greatest success?" Walter looked at the handful of grain resting in his palm. "Not this variety," he answered softly. He smiled toward the students. "The people willing to keep planting after I'm gone." One by one, he handed each student a small cloth seed bag. "These aren't souvenirs," he said. "They're responsibilities." Every student accepted the seeds with both hands. Years later, after Walter Harper passed away peacefully at the age of 92, Harper Farm was preserved as the Harper Agricultural Heritage Center. Before beginning research, every new plant breeder, agronomy student, and seed conservation scientist visiting the center, first walked through the original 80-acre field, studied Walter's handwritten notebooks, examined Grace's letter, and stood before the old weathered metal seed box that had protected the precious grain through 4 decades of quiet work. Above the entrance to the research center, a single inscription welcomed every visitor. The greatest farmer is not the one who grows the biggest harvest. The greatest farmer is the one who leaves the soil stronger, the seeds wiser, and the future more hopeful than when they first began. Most visitors admired the scientific achievement represented by the Harper Heritage grain, but those who truly understood Walter and Grace's story saw something even greater. They saw 2 ordinary people who had refused to measure success by profit, choosing instead to spend nearly half a century creating a gift they would never fully live, to see benefit the world. Their fields eventually fed far more than the families living nearby. They nourished future generations of farmers, strengthened communities facing uncertain climates, inspired researchers searching for sustainable agriculture, and reminded the world that the most valuable harvest is often the one quietly planted for people we will never meet. The story of Walter and Grace Harper quickly spread far beyond the quiet fields of Iowa. News organizations first reported it as the remarkable discovery of a rare heritage grain hidden beneath an ordinary family farm. But as more people learned the full story, they realized it was never really about an extraordinary seed. It was about 2 ordinary people who had quietly devoted nearly half a century of their lives to protecting something they believed should belong to everyone. In the years that followed, the Harper Heritage grain was planted in communities facing drought, flooding, and increasingly unpredictable weather. Farmers who had never met Walter Harper began harvesting crops from seeds that had once rested inside the small weathered metal box he carried every morning through his fields. Some families saved their farms during difficult seasons because those seeds endured when others failed. Others simply found hope in knowing that someone decades earlier had been thinking about people they would never live long enough to meet. Each spring, agricultural students from across the country traveled to the Harper Agricultural Heritage Center. Before entering laboratories or research fields, they were brought to the original farmhouse porch, where Walter had spent countless evenings recording weather observations by hand. There, the guides never began by explaining genetics, hybridization, or plant breeding. Instead, they opened Grace Harper's letter. Then they showed the visitors Walter's first notebook. Its earliest pages were filled with failure, crosses that never germinated, plants destroyed by frost, harvests ruined by drought, entire seasons ending in disappointment. One student once asked the guide, "Why don't you start by showing us the successful harvests?" The guide smiled, because without these failures, he gently turned another page, none of the successes would exist. Beside the notebook, the old metal seed box remained exactly as Walter had left it. The paint was still chipped, the hinges still squeaked, the cloth seed bags were carefully arranged inside. Nothing about it looked valuable. Yet every visitor who stood before that simple box understood they were looking at something more precious than gold. Not because of the seeds it contained, but because of the patience, sacrifice, hope, and love that had filled it for 45 years. Above the display hung one final photograph. It showed Walter and Grace standing together in the middle of the very first experimental field, smiling as though they already knew what those tiny plants might one day become. Beneath the photograph, a single bronze plaque carried the words, "The future is not built by those who ask what the land can give them. It is built by those who ask what they can leave behind for the land and for the people who will one day depend upon it." Perhaps that is why Walter Harper never believed he was creating a new grain variety. He believed he was simply keeping a promise to the soil that had raised him, a promise to the wife who had stood beside him through every failed harvest and every hopeful spring, and a promise to generations of strangers he would never meet. Because the greatest harvest any farmer can leave behind is not measured in bushels, acres, or profit. It is measured in the number of lives that continue to grow because one person chose to plant hope, protect it with patience, and freely pass it on to the future.